Woke up this morning, got yourself a gun. Better know you want to tell everyone. You better woke up this morning, got the blue moon in your eye. Woke up this morning, woke up morning. Hey guys, I'm Steve. Hey guys, Steve-O here from Movies and TVs on the Ball. And I just did a podcast recently, a couple months back, on Breaking Bad, and I discussed in another video kind of the differences between Tony Soprano and um, Walter White, and just kind of how those two kind of are different. And so I did a video on the pilot episode. This is going to be part of pilot season. Come fly with me, where I look at pilot episodes of television series and just give you kind of my thoughts instead of going through the entire series. I'm just going to look at the pilot episode. So on this version, I'm going to look at The Sopranos. That is kind of was a HBO at the time in 1999. The Sopranos was really the show that kind of gave the edge, and ironically, kind of gave the edge to television. And HBO was the one that kind of pushed that boundaries. You had shows like Oz, and you had shows like The Sopranos, and then, ironically, uh, AMC about 10 years later, about 9 years later, they started doing their own shows with The Walking Dead and shows like um, Breaking Bad. And so I was really intrigued by this. I guess before I start, I was kind of really intrigued by The Sopranos when it came out, or when it was on television. Just so, I was like kind of one of those shows I've kind of heard about, and it's really good. Had really good reviews, and sort of, for me, Sopranos came out when I was 11 back in 1999. So it was very kind of in the same way how at that time the way R-rated movies have the same stigma that a lot of R-rated movies have. That's what Sopranos felt like to me when I watched it for the first. But watching it now at the first time, I was interested in kind of more, looking at it now with comparing it to something like, say, like Breaking Bad or House of Cards, where we are kind of following, uh, like in Breaking Bad, Walter White slowly go from, a good guy, but in his mind he is the bad guy. And with Sopranos, Tony Soprano having to kind of is still sort of, because we're following along with him, we realize that Tony Soprano is also the bad guy. Still is still also known as the bad guy. Um, so so I was kind of really kind of intrigued by kind of this show. And so I wanted to take a look at, I'm not going to go through the whole entire series. I'm just going to kind of look at the pilot and give you kind of my first impressions of this. So I'm finally here. I'm finally talking about the pilot. So let's do it to it. We're going to discuss the pilot episode of The Sopranos. So, first, let's get through the meat and potatoes of The Sopranos. It was directed and written by David Chase, who was creator of the Rockford Files, Northern Exposure, and also worked on Alfred Hitchcock Presents. It starred James Gandolfini, who you probably know from this show, but if you not, you probably know him from films such as Get Shorty. He was in a really good romantic comedy that came out his last, I think, the year he died, with Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Elaine from Seinfeld, in Enough Said. He had a small miniature role in A Civil Action with John Travolta, and he was a bad guy ish in The Mexican. He plays Tony Soprano. Now Tony Soprano is the is sort of our kind of who we're following along for the most part, and how and he is the sort of Don of New Jersey, and he basically is someone who he's our main focus of this series. Then you had Lori Barracuda from film. She's best known for films such as Goodfellas. She played Leonardo DiCaprio's mother in The Basketball Diaries. She was in. She's recently been in episodes of Blue Bloods, and she was in the film Hackers. She plays Doctor Jennifer Milfy, who is Tony Soprano's um, psychiatrist that he goes and sees throughout the series. Then you had his wife, Carmela Soprano, played by Edie Falco. You know her from Nurse Jackie. She plays Nurse Jackie. She was Hillary Clinton in American Crime Story, season 3, which was about the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which was ironically happening at the same time as this. She was in episodes of Law and Order. She was in Law and Order True Crimes about the Menendez brothers. Her recent role was in Avatar 2, Avatar The Way of Water. She plays Carmela Soprano, who is Tony Soprano's wife, and she kind of throughout the show or throughout the pilot, she has sort of a spiritual she's kind of conflicted spiritually. And then you had Michael Imperola, who you know from Goodfellas, The Lovely Bones. He worked with Bad Boys, which I will get to, with Martin Lawrence and Will Smith. He plays the tire guy. He also worked with Will Smith in the film Shark Tale as well. He was also in Basketball Diaries with Lori Baracuco. So that's kind of a connection there. He plays Christopher Molestia, who is uh, Tony Soprano's nephew, and sort of he's trying to become a made man. Then you had Steve Van Zandt, who was in movies such as 9 Months, The Irishman, American Dad, Darren, and he also sang the song All Alone on Christmas for Home Alone 2. He plays Sylvia Dante, who is kind of the right hand man. Um, he's sort of the right hand man of to Tony Soprano in the Domingo crime family boss. Uh, um, then you had Robert Ehler, who is plays AJ Soprano, who is Tony Soprano's son. You know him from he was the bully in Daredevil. He was in episodes of Oz, which was another HBO show. He showed up in both Law and Order and Law and Order SVU. Then you had Meadow Soprano, Tony Soprano's daughter, played by Jamie Lynn Singler, who was in Entourage. She was in Last Man Standing with Tim Allen. She was called Call Me the Rise and Fall of Heidi Fleiss film as Heidi Fleiss, and she's recently been in Ugly Betty. And she plays Meta Soprano, who's Tony Soprano's teenage daughter, who's in high school. In the pilot episode, she's a junior in high school, and she's kind of looking at schools to go to. Um, then you had uh, Livia Soprano, played by Nancy Marchita. She was in films such as Sabrina. I recently watched The Naked Gun and realized she is the mayor of Los Angeles in The Naked Gun. She was in episodes of Coach. She was in episodes of Cheers. And she's also done episodes of Law and Order as well. Then you had Hirsch Respersky, played the kind of another one of these gangsters, I guess, is played by is Hirsch. Herman Hirsch Respersky is a supporting character in the HBO crime television series The Sopranos. He is the close Jewish associate to the Domingo crime family. Uh, so he and he sort of works with Tony Soprano. Or at least that's kind of what I'm getting with in the pilot episode. He's played by uh, Jerry Adler, who was in episodes of Mad About You, episodes of West Wing, Spin City with Michael J. Fox, and Northern Exposure, just to name a few. He is sort of, and then you had Dominic Chinessi, who plays Junior Soprano, Tony's uncle, and he was in films such as Godfather Part 2, Dog Day Afternoon with Al Pacino, All the President's Men with Robert Redford and Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman, excuse me. And he was in episodes. He's recently been in Blue Bloods and episodes of Broadwalk Empire. He is um, Tony Soprano's uncle and sort of the. I think he becomes more of the antagonist throughout the entire series of kind of Tony's arch nemesis, if you will. Then you had then last but not least, you had John Ventimiglia, who was in Notorious about the notorious B.I.G. He was in movies such as Money Monster with George Clooney, episodes of Law and Order, episodes of White Collar, and Mickey Blue Eyes and NYPD Blue. He plays Artie Bucco, who is a restaurant owner who um, is kind of an ally of Tony. So that's pretty much the cast. The pilot episode pretty much starts out once we enter the the episode itself. So Tony is in a waiting room at a psychiatrist's office, waiting for Dr. Milfy to go into their first session. And he's sitting there and he's looking at this woman, the statue of this woman, uh, kind of kind of just pondering the image when Dr. Milfy comes in and says, you know, lets him sit down and kind of asks him, you know, how's he doing and what it was like um, the day he collapsed. So of the beginning of the episode, basically Tony is uh, narrating, kind of sets up sort of the world. So he talks about how his people, you know, had it good, and we kind of see the days that leads up to him collapsing, and he he gets up and we see him go straight to get the paper, and as he's getting the paper, he opens it, and we kind of see like, and I like how it's very dated in a way because this pilot came out in 1999, and we can kind of see subtles where it says Y2K, like on the paper, the headline reads Y2K Clinton, President Clinton was worried about will Y2K wipe out the, you know, will disconnect everything. And this is going on all while he's monologuing kind of this thing, and he talks about the the burst of the 2000s, and then Tony says in his voiceover he thinks about his father, that his father never reached the heights like he did. And we see Tony walking, and living in this big New Jersey, mansion, and we see him kind of kind of see where he's kind of living larger than life. And then he, he thinks his father, but he's worried that his father had it better than because his father has his people. And then you had Dr. Melfi say most Americans feel that way. And what I kind of like that this movie, or this show, excuse me, really sort of kind of in that scene about the American dream, was that when you look at stuff like Fight Club, Office Space, The Matrix, and or Office Space, The Matrix, and American Beauty. Matrix may be a little bit different, but
Alert from reminders. The shower.
but uh, the there was something in 1999 that was really interesting about where we were in society. Technology didn't kind of catch up to where it is today, 26 years later. But I think when you watch sort of those films, the characters are always trying to kind of just figure out their identity. And I think, in a way, Tony is kind of dealing with that too. But that's just a small observation that I kind of noticed with watching this episode again. But um, but going back to it, he ends up, reading the paper and going back to his backyard, where he looks around and he's looking around this pool, and then there's kind of a look on his face that he's missed it, but then he hears a and a bunch of ducks come into his how or his pool, and we hear in the narration that he basically is basically he or through the narration that he is been kind of caring for these ducks from duck and these little ducklings. So he's feeding these ducks, and as they're getting into his pool, they start swimming around. He slowly walks his way into the pool, and we kind of get more of through the voiceover of Meadow um, of how Tony's daughter has a best friend, Meadow, who was going to drive her to school, and but he tells Dr. Melfi, us the audience, that Carmilla kind of thinks that uh, Hunter, her friend, is a bad influence on their daughter, and so she starts talking to um, Hunter about um, about the about the ducks, and we kind of see this brother sister, and then Anthony Jr., who's celebrating his 13th birthday, uh, throughout this episode, takes a piece of the shabola cake, dips it in the milk, and eats it right in front of him, and it grosses him out. And we can kind of see that he kind of gets um, along with everybody. And then um, he kind of, and she's like, it's your 13th birthday, and it's his, and so she's like, she kind of coddles him a little bit, and then she offers Hunt Meadow and Hunter some last night's dessert, and they say, "Get away with that! Get away with that fat! I don't want it." And Carmela is kind of like saying, "You need to eat something more than just drink cranberry juice." And then we hear that he is that we can kind of see through Tony's narration that Carmela doesn't think that Hunter is a good role model um, for their daughter Meadow, and they're sort of Hunter kind of talks about that they're planning to go on a to um, trip to Aspen to go skiing, um, and Carmela kind of puts the brakes on her excitement to go skiing by saying that you need to, if you get your grades up and finish your homework and get your grades up, then you can go to Aspen to go skiing. Um, and then Tony comes in um, to the kitchen, and he comes to the kitchen and wishes Anthony Jr. AJ his happy birthday, and so Tony kind of greets the family, and as he's greeting the family, Tony goes straight to the books about birds and starts reading it when Carmela says, asks Tony about when will you be home for Anthony Jr.'s birthday, and he said, and Tony says that he will be coming home early from work, in which Camilla says, "I'm not talking about work." And then we kind of cut to um, the we cut to Tony talking to Dr. Milfy about um, his crime life, and he says I can't really go into detail about that. So Tony and then Dr. Milf go into more information talking about my personal life, in which Dr. Milfy says, "Tell me about the day that you collapsed." Tony continues telling the story, and we get an introduction to Christopher, who is his driver and right hand man, and he's and Tony is looking through the bird book and talking to Christopher, and asked him if he called Christopher about the hauling contract on the other side of town, in which Christopher tells Tony that he got home late last night. He didn't want to wake the man up, but in which Tony says, "Did you even call him this morning?" In which Christopher makes an excuse that he was nauseous this morning, and he says his mother just told him to call in sick. He should have called in sick today. And then we cut to back to Tony talking to Dr. Murphy that Christopher bought him a $60,000 Lexus. And then Tony and Christopher are driving around when they notice um, a guy named Alex Mahaffey, in which Tony tells Dr. Milfy that he had a he had a loan on something, and then Dr. Milfy kind of stops the conversation and says, um, 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 Dr. Milfy says, if I'm about this guy who has an extended loan, which Dr. cuts him off and saying, I don't know where this story is going, but if there is some there's some ethical ground rules we need to discuss, in which that she says what we talk about falls with the doctor patient confidentiality. Unless someone gets hurt or witnessing a murder, she would have to go to the authorities. And she says, technically. And he says, oh, nothing happened. We just talked. We had coffee. And Alex Mahaffey, who is played by Michael Gaston, who was in Bridge of Spies. He's recently been in the Daredevil sequel series, Born Again. And he says, we just had coffee. And I like the fact that Alex Melfi Mahaffey drops the uh, drops the cups of coffee, and they end up chasing him around uh, around keep chasing him around the park, and um, he so he's running around, and I kind of noticed that um, so they chase him around, and he's running around the park, and or I guess not the park, the campus of his work, and they hit him with his car, and he says, my leg is hurt, my leg is broken." And Tony says, "Oh yeah," and he punches him right into Mahaffey's leg, and he's and uh, and 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 I like that. So he says, broken, and he's pleading and crying. Tony says, you'll be all right. He says he looks at this sign and says, HMO, you're covered. Um, and starts asking. So then Tony starts asking Mahaffey about wanting his money. Then he starts, and then he starts, I'll get you the money, and he starts punching him, and and they start punching him. They keep punching Mahaffey in the face. Tony looks up and sees Christopher trying to fix parts of the front of the broken automobile of his Lexus, and Tony tells him to come over here and starts. And Christopher basically starts kicking him, even though Christopher's complaining the fact that he's got damages to his Lexus that cost $3,000 in damages. Christopher starts kicking Mahaffey in the stomach, and Tony says, "Where's my money?" And Mahaffey's crying and says, "I'll get you your money." He says, "That's right, you'll get your my money." And he says, I run things around here, and you keep telling people that I'm nothing, and you should get a cork stuck in your mouth for talking bad about me." And how he starts kind of wiping his hands and saying, "Quit crying, you have insurance." And then the next day, at like one of Tony's hanging spots, he's uh, talking to Salvatore, Paulie, and Silvio Dante, basically his crew. And Salvatore talks about the site manager renewing their contract with Richard, uh, but the Kolar brothers, a Czechoslovakian immigrants, want to do it for 700 a month less than what Tony is, 7,000 $7,000 a month less than what Tony's crew is wanting. And then the guy says, "I'm gonna tell the Czechoslovakian people to just don't worry about it. Just tell them that I'm going with them instead of Tony." Or he says, "If I tell the Czechoslovakians to screw off, then he can tell Tony's gang to do the same thing." Christopher tells Tony that I could. He asks Tony if he could take care of it, and he's going to talk to a guy named Emilia, and Tony's like, "Are you okay? Are you sure you can do it?" He's like, "Yeah, I can do it." And then Sylvia shows up where they're drinking coffee and tells Tony that his uncle Junior is getting going to whack Pussy Megalaga at Artie Buku's restaurant. Tony and Christopher and Tony and Christopher who go end up going to and they're going to basically whack him at the restaurant and burn it down. So Tony and Christopher drive to Artie's restaurant where he comes into a restaurant, he shakes hands with all the fellow mobsters. He and Chris go up to Uncle Junior, and I like how he goes up to Uncle Junior who's eating ravioli, and he says, "Don't move." He fakes a gun and says, "Don't move." And he's and then Uncle Junior hugs him and says, kind of greets him, and then they go and sit at a table, and we kind of get sort of a voiceover that Tony is kind of says, "My Uncle June, he is my father's brother. he used to take. He's just he's still there, but he's just getting up there in age. He used to take me to Yankees games, and then Tony and Tony and Christopher talk. Uh, then, and I like the fact that when he meets Aribuku, the uh, the um, the restaurant owner, his wife, Charmaine uh, Buki, played by Catherine Narduku, who was in Jersey Boys, The Irishman, episodes of Law and Order, Miracle on 34th Street. I think the 1994 version looks distasteful at Tony while picking up dishes. Uh, Tony, uh, after he talks to Arthur, he and Christopher get a seat, and Christopher says, "You know what would happen if somebody gets whacked in this room in Arthur's restaurant?" And Tony says, "Yeah, it'll ruin its business." And so he basically Tony is we get the backstory of Uncle Junior, who is Tony's father's brother. We hear that he's, according to Tony, that he's cranky, and he used to take Tony to Yankees games when he was a kid, and Tony starts looking very fondly at his uncle. But at the same time, Uncle Junior was told Tony's girl's cousins that he'll never be a varsity athlete, and that kind of ruined his self esteem. Um, then we see that as then Tony. Then we're also introduced to Tony's mother as Tony goes and delivers his mother a CD player, and and with the CD player, um, um, he's brings over a compact disc player, which was still big at the time, and he knocks on the door, and he's like, "Mom, open up," and she's like, "Who's there?" And Mom, and he says, "Who's there?" And it's like, "Me, Mom. Anthony?" "Yeah, Mom, it's me." And then she opens the door, and as she's opening the door, she says, "Someone," she's kind of senile because she says, "Someone tried to call the house after dark." And his mother's name is Olivia. And I like the fact that Tony walks into his mom's house, and he locks the door behind. He walks by. He does it. Olivia says to Tony that somebody called, and I like the fact that there she is. Somebody tried to call after dark, which to Tony's surprise, he asks, "Mom, I don't understand it. Dark is a light is a visual thing. The phone is an audio thing. I can understand uh getting people coming out screaming you at night, but the dark or coming out at night, but the phone, that's a little bit crazy." uh uh Dark thing, because getting jumped out of the shadow. dark, kind of getting shadows at night, but somebody calling at night, that's a wholly different thing. Then Tony, uh, then, uh, then Tony, then she offers, Tony, if offers lunch to Tony, saying, "Do you want eggplant?" And Tony's like, "Look, I've." Tony says, "No, thanks, Mom. I already ate." Um, and he kind of kindly declines. He says, Tony tells his mother that he ran into his Uncle June and talks about uh, Artie, the restaurant owner, and how it's going to make it hard for Artie. How it's going to make it hard. How Uncle Junior is going to make it hard for Artie. Olivia is bewildered by a CD player. So he says, "I've got the CD player for you," and she's like, "What is it?" And it's like, "It's for music." And he says, all your favorite songs are being reissued on CD, like Pajama Gang and Connie Francis. And then I like the fact that Tony turns on the music, and we see that, and he starts to try to dance with his mother. She kind of is a little bit embarrassed and kind of says, "No, no, no, I don't want to." Tony says, "You need." Tony starts to kind of Tony starts to kind of says, "You need to do something to occupy your mind. When Dad died, you were going to do so many things." Or and then I like the fact that, Olivia says, "Oh, he was a saint," and he's like, "Yeah, he was, but but you know what?" And Tony says it kind of bluntly that he's dead. And, and um, he says he's dead, and Tony uh and Tony says, "Yeah, he's dead. I thought, you know," and he's dead, and she's like, "But your dad." And then to Olivia's eyes, Tony's dad was a saint. Tony tells his mom that you were going to travel, you were going to get a volunteer job, but Tony says, "You've done nothing," in which Olivia snaps and says, "Stop trying to tell me how to live my life." And Tony's just like, "I just worry about you." And then they have a fight over, uh, Olivia and Tony have a fight over, wanting, him to Olivia to be in a nurse retirement community. Olivia thinks it's a nursing home, in which Tony says, "Look, we've been through this. It's not a nursing home. It's a retirement community. You'll be hanging out with kids your own age." And she's like, "Don't start with that nursing home business." I like the fact that they have a fight. Tony says, saying, "And old age, and go place and do things." And I like the fact that he's like, "You're gonna go do things with other people," and she's like, "I'm not going to be in a and nursing home and hanging out there and babbling like an idiot." I think I think um Tony looks at there's kind of Tony says it'll be a great way for you to kind of experience have an experience with other people and do more things with them. And Olivia sees it as, I'm going to be in a nursing home, I'm going to be in a bed, all the negative things. So I like how there's sort of a yin and yang to it a little bit. And then uh, so then then Olivia offers him to eat more of his eggplants, in which Tony says, "Look, I've already had lunch." Kind of declines it, says, "I've already had lunch." Then I like the fact that Tony asks his mom to talk to Uncle Junior, her brother-in-law, about Tony's about not not blowing up Artie's restaurants. And Olivia's like, I'm not in all this. It's if your uncle has business with what he's doing. Uh, and so they kind of have an argument, and Tony starts to have an argument about it, and then Tony changes the subject to Anthony's birthday's party and how he expects to see her mother there with her bake ziti. Olivia gives Tony one. Says, "I'll go to the store or to the party if I'm going to be picked up and brought back home." In her words, and she says, "I'm not gonna drive." In her words, when they predicting rains, and Tony going back to his therapist, tells her uh talks to him about the priest that who shows up at the party, um, named uh, Father Father Phil, played by Michael Sinatro Santoro, who was in Sense of a Woman, episodes of Miami Vice, Law and Order, Criminal Intent. Um, and the priest brought over cream agalissa, in which Anthony, who just got off the so he brought some food. So the priest brought some food over, and Anthony Jr. just AJ Soprano gets off the phone. Says, "I just got off the phone with Grandma, and she's not coming." And Carmela says, "Tony's mom needs a purpose in life." And I like the fact that he says, um, Anthony says he starts to swear, and he says, "So no freaking ZD." And he says it right in front of the priest, and the priest says, "Hey!" So he catches him, and he says, "Tony's just." So Tony starts to light a fire on the grill, and he's lit a fire on the grill, and he's looking out. Of course, being a mobster, he smokes a cigar right in front of where he's cooking, and he starts to have a heart attack. And I like how he explains it. How he says, "First thing I felt was ginger ale rushing through my skull, and he passes out, and he goes in for, and he passes out, causing the meat to burn. Like we see this huge flame, and the meat burns, and they all kind of come to his rescue, and then he is rushing into he's rushed into an MRI, or he's rushed into the hospital where he's lying on the MRI bed waiting to go in, and into the doctor, who's the doctor, or MRI technician who's running the MRI, tells him, when you're in the MRI, there's a microphone so he's in the MRI, and he's telling him basically the prep, that there's a microphone just in case you get claustrophobic, to use the microphone. And he, or I guess they're putting on they put on these sort of glasses that I guess zone out your, anyway. So he's getting ready to go to MRI, and then Carmela shows up. Uh, 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 she shows up, and Tony says it's 6:30 in the morning, and is wondering how it's 6:30 in the morning, and he's wondering how the kids are doing. Which Carmela says, the kids are worried about you, Tony. Um, Tony, and she also lets Tony know that we are going to reschedule AJ's birthday. Rescheduled Anthony Jr.'s birthday. Tony Tony then asks Camilla, if he, kind of in a more fearful way, do you think I have a brain tumor? Uh, and then I like the fact that he starts saying, we had some good times, didn't we? Like he starts sort of playing this, what would happen if I almost die, kind of thing. Uh, and and then I like the fact that he starts complaining um, about the priest, and so they have an argument, uh, complaining about the priest being around the house all the time, in which Camilla says, "Don't even go there. He is helping me becoming a better Catholic. He is a spiritual mentor." And then Tony goes into the MRI machine. Well, while this while this is going on, Christopher is meeting up at the meat market, handling the garbage contract problem. And we see Christopher doing some medit- meditation when Emil Cooler, the one they were talking about outside the meat market. Emil Cooler is played by Bruce Smilanoff from Dancing in September, Law and Order, SVU, Brecken, and Brecken 2, Electric Boogaloo. He was also in the movie Made and Blacklist with Ultron. Christopher invites him in, and I like the fact that he invites him in. It's like email, and he says, "You and I are." So Christopher goes and kind of offers him Budweiser, and he starts to make small talk about how they are the younger generation, and we need to, garbage is our bread and butter, kind of thing. And he says, where's the stuff? And he's like, yes. So he brings out butcher knife with I guess cocaine on it, and so Emiel starts sniffing, starts basically doing some cocaine, some cocaine, and we see we see Christopher take out a gun and shoot Emilia in the back of the head, and we see, I mean, and that's the thing about The Sopranos. What makes it so violent is we see the blood spew out everywhere, and we get like one, two, and what's interesting is that when he kills Emilia, as he's shooting each bullet, Emilia, um, Emilia, or we see a bunch of pictures of old gangsters, and we see like uh, Dean pictures of Dean Martin, and so he ends up killing him. So then we cut to another session with uh, Dr. Milfy, and uh, so he talks about the test that the doctor took with his MRI, and tells her about them playing a round of golf with his uncle and having lunch, in which Dr. Murphy says, "You keep mentioning your uncle. What seems to be the problem?" So Tony and Uncle Junior are walking out. So they just had lunch at um, Artie Buku's restaurant, and Uncle Junior asks Tony, "Who does he think he is?" And Tony says, "I'm the one who runs things around here." Tony tells his uncle not to whack Salvador at Artie's restaurants. One of Junior Men says, "Versalgi is a perfect restaurant to kill Salvatore because he's been eating at this restaurant all his life." And then Tony's kind of like saying, "Don't kill him here. You kill him somewhere else." And then Uncle Junior kind of snaps at Tony and says, "How many?" Uh, says, "You may run New Jersey, but you don't run your Uncle Junior." And Uncle Junior says, "How many times have I played catch with you?" And then he ends up walking off. And then Tony explains to Dr. Melfi, and he goes back to kind of how we kind of get to know Camilla and Meadow aren't getting along, because we see Father Phil and Camilla watching TV, and Father Phil says, "These laser discs are incredible." Camilla says Tony watches Godfather Part 2 at the all the time on laser discs. And I think they kind of talk about basically how, Godfather kind of, which Godfather was better. And he's like, "Well, I liked one and two. Two was better, but three, they act like, well, what just happened?" And so as they're kind of watching the movie, kind of watching TV, Carmela hears some some movement coming from the upstairs. So Camilla thinks someone's breaking in. So Camilla kind of goes straight into the hallway, or the hallway, and opens up sort of closet that has an AK-47 in there. So she, thinking that someone was breaking in, the motion sensor lights turn on, and she says, "Hold it!" and points the gun at none other than her daughter, who she was like, or I thought you were Meadow. I thought you were doing your homework, and he's like, she starts to kind of say, "Well, I couldn't really see anything," and then the conversation goes into uh, a guy named Patrick who I guess she has a crush on, says that he has a swim meet tomorrow and he needs me for moral support. Uh, and then he needs me for moral support. And then I like the fact that AJ comes by and says, "Hey, what's going on?" And immediately, um, Meadow says, "You locked my door on purpose." And she's like, and then she then Carmela basically says, you're grounded and you're not going to Aspen." And the trip is off, and you can see on and look on her face is like she looks like she is completely stunned that her mother would do such a thing like that. Uh, uh, and then you're not going to Aspen with Hunter. Cut to Tony talking to Dr. Melfi that everything will blow over, which Dr. Melfi says, "Didn't you tell Dr. Cusimano that you were feeling depressed?" Tony looks around the room to lighten the subject. He looks over at so he's kind of like looking around the room to lighten the subject, and he starts to kind of look at Dr. Melfi's um, um, degree that's hanging on the wall, and notices that her name is Italian and asks where she's from in Italy by saying, which, uh, what part of the boot you from? Jennifer from Melfi, and she kind of corrects her by saying Dr. Melfi. Tells Tony that her family was from Consorta, and Tony says, "I was from Avellino." He then starts to make a word that he kind of starts to say, "My mother and your mother, my mother would love it if you and I could have gotten together." And then Tony looks around, and then uh, Dr. Melfi then she says, anxiety attacks are very real. And she says, suppose you were driving and you passed out. Uh, this boils Tony's blood, and he says, nowadays everybody has to go to shrinks and counselors and go on Sally, Jesse, Raphael and talk about their problem. Like he starts blurting it out that, um, blurting it out that, um, that everything is so medicated, pretty much. And he says, the whatever to the strong, silent type like Gary Cooper, that calls him. I know that was an American. Then Tony starts going to the rage and says, then it starts with, then it's dysfunction this and dysfunction that. Then he gets angry and tells Dr. Melfi that he had that he gets angry and he starts saying, look, I've had a career, I've had a couple classes of junior college, so I know a little thing about Freud. Um, and he gets kind of starts Freud and understand psychiatry. He understands psychiatry as a concept. She then asks point blankly, "Does he feel depressed?" And I like the fact that when he does that, is I think he kind of gets into a real quick like manic state, and he kind of, and she asks him kind of point blankly, "Does he feel depressed?" And he says, "I did once the ducks left." Then she starts to pick his brain a little bit by asking him about the ducks that infuriate talks about the ducks, and this kind of infuriates Tony, and Tony walks out of her office, slams the door. Meanwhile, after murdering Emil, both Christopher and Salvatore, or Big Pussy as he's called, says the cooler uncle, Kolak uncle, is going to find the kid dead in one of his bins and gets out of our business no way, in which Christopher says Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes. And I like the fact that Salvatore corrects him by saying Luca, by calling him Luca Brasi. There's a difference between Luca Brasi's situation and putting a corpse into a dumpster. And the Korla, and he's basically saying that um, we keep the Kolak brothers. Kolak, they know the kid is going to be dead, and then it hardens their position. And Salvatore says, "Now the cops are looking for a murderer." Then Christopher asks Salvatore, "What does he want to do?" Salvatore says, "Luca disappears. He never comes home. They know, but they don't know. They're hoping maybe he turns them up. But then decides instead of throwing him in the trash compactor, they take him to Staten Island and cut them off in the pieces. So then we kind of see Tony. So they basically are taking care of the body that they just murdered. Um, that Christopher just murdered. Then Tony Soprano is is with his family and his mother, and they're looking at retirement centers, and aka nursing homes. We see nursing home director played by Justine Marcel, who was in Seinfeld in New York Undercover, and The Pretender. Anyway, giving the tour. They're walking through the retirement smart main hall, and then she sees that a woman is giving a lecture. And I like the fact that Anthony Jr. says, "Grandma, this is kind of," he's holding his grandmother's hand and saying, "This place is pretty neat. You need to take a look at it." And then, but uh, then she looks over at a hallway and she says, "What's that over there?" In which the retirement director says, "That's our nursing home. That's our nursing unit." And this shocks Olivia, saying, um, "This is a nursing home." And she starts kind of getting into a huff and saying, "You guys are putting me in a nursing home." And she says, "No, we're not. We're just trying to um, help. We're just trying to help. And then Tony's like, Mom, you need to calm down. And he's trying to calm his mother down and says, You're not listening. As Tony starts having an argument with his mother about the nursing home, he starts having another panic attack and starts to breathe heavily and ends up collapsing on the floor. We then see Tony kind of coming back to Dr. Melfi. He's sitting in a chair, he has his hands in his face, and he's kind of ashamed of what happened, coming back and talking to the therapist. Dr. Murphy tells Tony that she's glad he came back for help, and she tells him not to look at this as a defeat. Then Tony starts talking about how his mother grew up the depression, but the depression to her was like Six Flags and not like what he's experiencing. Now, Dr. Murphy should suggests that he should stay with his mother. Then Tony starts talking about his father, and I like the fact that how we kind of the father, at least in the pilot episode, is kind of a mystery, and how his father, according to Olivia, that his father was, in her eyes, a saint, and how Tony's dad was tough, and how Tony ran his own crew, his but also how the way his mother would really soften Tony's father. Tony then tells Dr. Milfy that he's having trouble in his business, and he's like, because of Rico, and she's like, who's that? Your brother? And he talks about the Rico status and how the government is using, surveillance to kind of squeeze his business using electronical, uh, and then Dr. Milfy kind of says right straight to Tony's face that, do you feel like you have any ethical qualms about how Tony is making a living as a mob boss? And so, and then Tony says not really, or not really, but he says it kind of like government witness. And Dr. Murphy writes, and he says everybody's turning government witness. And then Dr. Murphy takes out a pen and writes him a that prescription. And I like how Tony says, "Oh my gosh, here comes the Prozac." So we kind of can see that um, Tony is, I think, after kind of his collapse, Tony's really trying to get help, and he's a little bit kind of concerned about, should he really take the drugs. Then we cut to a strip club that is run by one of his partners. Um, we see Christopher and Hirsch talking about Mahaffey, the guy that they ran over with his car. not having the money. Christopher says, "We ran over Mahaffey in the car, and Mahaffey's blood." Hirsch asked Tony that he heard that Junior wants to whack Pussy Mananga, and he said he calls it Pussy Mananga, and AKA Little Pussy. That's his name. I'm sorry. Um, then Hirsch talks about Tony's. Hirsch is basically kind of giving the tells talks about Tony's Tony's uncle, how Tony is being made the boss of the family, and the fact that Tony's uncle, who was the older brother of Tony's father, who basically his younger brother, his nephew ended up getting was his younger brother was a made man before his uncle was, and now he tells Tony about how Uncle Junior can't handle him taking over the business. So basically, Tony is. I think it's just basically telling you that Uncle Junior still feels a little bit betrayed, that, or kind of feels underneath Tony for taking on the business. So then, so then, Hirsch basically tries to get Artie to um, Artie out of the restaurant for a while, so uh, they can blow up, they can whack, uh, do the job of whacking Artie, blowing up Artie's business. And he says, give him, and then so Tony goes over to the restaurant the next day with two tickets to a cruise that Tony has basically forged by saying that due to a dental plan, kind of him doing a dental plan, they all pitched in to give him a comped cruise ship. And Artie is a little bit kind of, Artie is sort of kind of a little bit naive by saying, "Oh, this is great," and yet Camilla, his wife, Artie's wife, is kind of thinks that this is, is a big, kind of big red flag that this might be a scam. Um, uh, Scam, and she says, someone broke their kneecaps for these tickets. And I like the fact that Artie still thinks that Tony is a union labor leader. So I think I might have gotten this mixed up, but we kind of see but before that, Tony was um, kind of doing they he talking to Hesh about and kind of an insurance medical scam that they were working on with phony claims, but um which he in which they can get needs to pay Hirsch the 250 grand that Tony knows Mahaffey cannot do, or they will kill him. Tony says it could be as good as garbage. in which Christopher says garbage is our bread and butter, in which Tony knows that it was back at the Sopranos residence. So I like how so we're kind of back at the Sopranos residence. Camilla is basically getting ready to go into town into New York to go to the uh, Plaza Hotel where they're going to eat scones and be next to Eloise's portrait in New York, and Tony, or not Tony, so he goes over to she goes up to Meadow's room, and Meadow's like, I don't really want to go. And she says, but you've been going, and then, um, let's see. Then, uh, Carmela says, but you've been coming with us. We've been doing this for years now. And then, um, Meadow says, I've liked it, but I thought this was stupid since I was 8. And then Carmela says, well, I wish we could have done this when you had girls of your own. She wants to make this a tradition. And it's just this moment where I think Camilla and her daughter can kind of have a moment together. Um, and then I like the fact that, or the moment together, but Meadow finds it kind of like it kind of Meadow kind of finds it stupid, so she then goes to her computer and starts on her homework. Carmela says that Meadow, you can't just lie and cheat and break the rules you don't like. And I like the fact that she gives yeah, she's looking on her computer, and then she turns around to over to Mahaffey, or turns her over to her mother and just gives her kind of this evil smirk. Um, and then Carmela kind of tells her goodbye, and like a teenage girl says, she's like, "Just close my door, please." Meanwhile, back to where Tony and Christopher are at Artie's restaurant, and they're walking in the kitchen, and they talk to Artie, and Tony offers Artie tickets to a cruise line to the Caribbean for this month that lasts for about 3 weeks. He tells him that I have a pair of tickets. Tells him I have a pair of tickets, and Artie's like, "Where'd you get these tickets?" He says, "Well, a couple of people from the union got together did a dental plan, and the dentist pitched in and basically gave them money to kind of comp the uh, kind of give the union, because Tony says I use the um I use these to dismantle a dental pan. That's his kind of cover of how he's going to get him out of the restaurant to blow it up. Then we're cut to Dr. Jennifer Milfy preparing for Tony psych psychiatric session, and she opens the door. And I love the fact that she has like candles blown or burning, and she's getting ready, and it looks like she's getting ready for a date. But she puts on her coat. She walks out and says, "Mr. Soprano, no one's there." Um, back at Artie's restaurants, back at Artie's restaurant, so So they're shutting down. They're about to kind of wrap up the for the night, and Artie's kind of pleading with his wife that Tony gave him these ticket. You know, he's like I said, he's very he's like Tony's a labor leader, and she's like Arthur, don't you understand that that um somebody had to donate their kneecaps, and Artie, who's still kind of oblivious, says Tony is a labor leader, and and Carmela says, "Don't you think that the Dawn of New Jersey that the she has to host these mobsters? It's bad enough that she has to host these mobsters at our restaurants, in which that already says, but we're not connected." In which Carmela says, "Right, because we just turned down those tickets." Arthur pleads with his wife that the tickets were complimentary and that Tony is a labor leader. So Arthur really thinking that Tony has his best interest in his restaurant. Camilla says, "Look, somebody donated their kneecaps for those tickets because she thinks it's a highly unlikely that the Dawn of New Jersey is giving tickets to a first class Norwegian cruise ship." Arthur feels uh, Arthur feels a little bit kind of embarrassed that Tony has been playing him, and he puts his hands in his head. And then we kind of cut to the person who had to give the kneecaps, the HOA guy who they ran over with the car at the beginning of the episode. He's on crutches, and they are kind of near a waterfall, and uh, uh, and it's Alex Mahaffey are at the waterfall with Alex Mahaffey, Hirsch, and Salvatore, he's now on crutches due to the broken leg caused by Tony. Hirsch and Salvatore are telling him to subvert his company to pay claims for MRIs that never happened. Then Salvatore says the paperwork will will just look like the real stuff. And I love the fact he's like they're licking ice cream together, and he says licking ice cream, and Happy says, "How will I do it without getting caught?" He's caught. "So you shouldn't be talking like this. You're a smart guy." In which Mahaffey says, "I'm depressed. I'm so depressed. I can't sleep or eat." And he starts kind of saying, "Well, what have you been taking? Like, what pills have you been taking?" And he says, "I'm on Prozac." He said, ask him if it's Prozac, and he says, "It's Zolac." We find out that Mahaffey is in a gambling debt, and Mahaffey's hoping that the antidepressants will help him with compulsion for gambling behaviors. Hirsch tells Alex about his gambling debts, and Alex is apologetic to Herman about not paying him. Then Hirsch suggests Mahaffey to look at the rocks. And he says, "Why don't we look at the rocks?" And he's like, "I'm fine." He says, "Yeah, it's just a beautiful thing." And then they go and he looks out, and Lucky, the uh, big pussy, I guess his name, licks his ice cream and throws it out, and we hear the ice cream truck leave, and a bunch of these kids. Then the guy on a bike follows the ice cream truck, and Mahaffey kind of gets scared and says, "Yeah, I'll sign those. I'll make those. He says, you know what? I'll sign those pages for Tony. Yeah." And he's like, "That's good. That's good." Then and go with the phony MRIs. Then Tony is on uh, the Kolak brothers withdrew their bid, and then he's at the I guess the landfill, and they're pushing up garbage, and Artie Buku wants to see Tony at a landfill, and Artie Buku hands Tony the tickets and tells him he can't leave town, and Tony talks to him and says, "Already, Artie, we discussed this. You got to leave town." And Artie says, "I'm sorry." Hands Tony the tickets. Then tickets at a rest. Then at a restaurant, we see a man. So then we cut to a restaurant where we see a man pleading with the hostess about having a table ready for them, that he has had these reservations for about 2 weeks. Now, this man is Dr. Jennifer Milfy's husband. He goes and uh, tells his wife that he just talked to the hostess. Jennifer Melfi suggests that they go to another restaurant to eat. Then Tony Soprano comes in the front door. Um, Jennifer takes her glass and turns away, knowing that Tony is her. Tony's the door. As Tony's led in by the maitre d', he and Ira, his date, he's with, notices his psychiatrist being at the same restaurant that he is. Tony runs into a psychiatrist, and I like the fact that he plays it off by saying, "You come here," and Jennifer says, "Yes, when possible." Tony then says, "Thanks for those decorating tips. They really work." Kind of, making the drugs that not that big of a deal, and and he's and I like the fact that we see Dr. Murphy plays it cool, in which uh, Tony's with her husband Richard shows up and says, "Is that Tony? How do you know Tony?" And she's like, "Is he a patient of yours?" And she's like, "Richard, shut the hell up. I can't explain. I can't do uh, patient confidentiality." And then we see Irina, or after dinner, Irina, Tony's date from dinner, and Tony are on a boat. And Irina asks Tony, "Who was that woman who was at the restaurant?" Tony says she's just a decorator, in which Ira says, "You're decorating the garbage dump?" Tony chases her around, chases Irina around, who is naked, with only a captain's hat. So that's one thing I noticed too, is this show isn't really, I mean, it is very raunchy. Just the fact that we see like a naked woman in silhouette, just and but that's just anyway. Um, we just talk. The next night, Tony and he just talks, and then he then we see the next night at the same restaurant, Tony and Camilla go come in, and Tony shakes the hand with the host. Tony and Camilla are sitting down at their table drinking wine. Tony says, "You know," he's swiveling his wine around, says, "You know, life is good." And she says, "Life," and Carmela says, "Life is always good." And Tony compliments the wine, and Carmela asks him, "You've been in good spirits." And I like the fact that Tony is like, you know, he's like really in a good mood, and then um the last couple of days, Tony leans into the table and covers, or she's like, "You've been in good spirits for good days. What's going on?" And Tony leans into the table and kind of covers his face and says, "I've been seeing a therapist." And there's just this look on Camilla's face that says, "Oh, this is so great. This is so wonderful. This is so wonderful." And, well, it's not really. And she kind of says, this is good for the mind. It's not necessarily good for the soul, but this is a start. This is a start. And then Tony's like, look, I can't tell anybody. You're the only one I told um, that you're the only one I told. And she's like, "Oh, I didn't know that Tony was so," and she's the only one told. And Prozac, and he's been seeing a therapist. Camilla says, "This is a sign of relief. Oh my God, I think that's great." And she says, "So wonderful and gutsy." Tony tries to calm her down. Camilla sees that it's a start to finding his way. Tony tells Camilla that she's the only one who knows. The only reason he's telling her is that because she's his wife. And I like the fact that Tony is, Camilla's like, "I didn't know you were unhappy." And then um, Tony was so unhappy. Tony says he's not sure Camilla, he doesn't really know if he's sure if he's unhappy or not. He's still kind of trying to figure this out. And then Camilla asks Tony if he's talked to the therapist about his father. But Camilla says his mother, who's the one to kind of continues the conversation by saying, "I just feel lately like my life is out of balance." Then Camilla gives her spiritual side and says, "Our existence on this earth is a puzzle. Even my own daughter hates me." And I think Carmela kind of thinks that, I think Tony's dealing with a lot of uh, psychological issues, and Camilla is dealing with more of her relationship with her daughter. And I like the fact that Tony says to Camilla that Meadow doesn't hate you. Meadow, Camilla, and she kind of, Meadow still loves his mother and then um, they kind of look, and then At the Soprano household, we uh, Meadow answers the phone, and it's Christopher. Carmela, and right when they're answering the phone, Carmela and Tony walk in the door, and Carmela says, "I bought you your favorite meal, parmigiana." And she's like, "Dad, it's Christopher." And she completely, or Meadow completely ignores her mother and hands Christopher, or hands Tony the phone for Tony to talk to Christopher. Um, and then Christopher says it's got to go down soon, which he's watching the news and they're talking about the he's watching the newscast about little pussy Managa, who came into town and was arrested when he got into town. Christopher says it's got to go down soon, which Tony says I'm gonna put it right to bed. The next day, we see Meadow having a volleyball game outside. Tony and Silvio are watching Meadow's volleyball game. Silvio, who I think has a daughter with Tony, with Meadow, um, volleyball game, and Silvio asks Tony, "When does he need this by?" Tony says, "Right away." We watch the game, and then after the game, Meadow wants out to meet her father. So that after the game, they kind of and meet her father, who is sitting on the bench. Meadow asks, Meadow kind of is asking Tony, why did mom not come? Tony said, I don't think you wanted her to come. Then, as they walk out of the school, they say hi to Silvia Dante and her daughter, and he ends up walking around into, and they get into school. They say show up to the volleyball game, and she's talking about it, and she's like, "Dad, I don't know why about this, why mom's freaking out." And Tony's kind of walking slowly into a church. And Tony looks and notices this church, and they walk into the church while Meadow thinks it's odd that Carmela didn't show up for her daughter's game. And so Meadow's kind of basically like going, but what about mom at Aspen trips? And Tony is completely smiles this and walks into the church and he's just in an amazement, and he looks around and around and looks at the architecture. They go sit down in the pew, and Tony says, it's been years since I've been in a church here, while Meadow is pleading with her father to talk to her mother. Meadow asks, "Why are they sitting there?" In which Tony replies, "You mother," and I like the fact that Tony says, "Your mother says you could be a top student," and then Meadow, who I think you kind of can notice that Meadow is having such a hard time trying to kind of academically trying to get her stuff together. And she asked Tony, what do they really want? Do they want her to be perfect and have perfection? And Tony, looks kind of oblivious and to what Meadow had to say, looks up and admires the architecture. Meadow says, "What are you looking at?" Then Tony says, "Your great grandfather and his brother Frank, they built this place." And Meadow says, "Big whoop." And Tony kind of gives the history of the church about how they came over from Italy to build this church. Meadow scoffs again and says, "Yeah, right. Two guys." And Tony corrects her by saying, "Yeah, there were two guys and a bunch of laborers. They did design it, but they knew how to build it." And Meadow looks around at the architecture of the church and the artwork in the church. Then architecture of the church, and I think it's a moment where, uh, I think if you can, I mean, kind of, I can see this moment being sort of where, the fact that he's, there. It's not really about sort of. It could have been a scene of him kind of having remission, but it's more about the architecture than anything. But anyway, and then we cut to that night. Silvio is walking by Artie's restaurant, and it explodes. Then we see Tony in therapy with Dr. Jennifer, telling her that he feels good now and he won't be needing her services anymore. And Dr. Murphy says that it's not the Prozac that's making you feel happy, Tony. Tony is a little bit surprised. It's like, well, what do you mean? And says, "You're not." Says, "Why not?" And which Dr. Murphy explains that the Prozac takes several weeks to take effect, and says, effect affect levels in the blood. Tony says, "Well, what is it then?" And Dr. Melfi says, "Coming here, talking, opening up. Hope comes in many forms," Dr. Melfi says. What what is it that you want to say to me? In which Tony starts to go into a dream that he had the the previous night. He talks about how his belly button had to screw his kind of this really weird dream pretty much. He talks about how like a bird picked up um wiener and flies away with it. This is a metaphor. And Dr. Murphy says this is a metaphor. Murphy asks Tony, "What type of bird was it?" Tony says it was probably a seagull or something. And Dr. Murphy says, "Was it a water bird?" The session fires and just water birds season. Was it a water bird? And just saying that, what else is a water bird? Tony realizes that it's the ducks. Tony starts to tear up a little and and he talks kind of about how the ducks um, were um, a family and how the ducks were a uh, metaphor to him that because the ducks kind of represent Tony's family And Tony feels like it was such a trip to have those creatures come to you and have them come to your pool, and he sees them as his babies. And he sees, because the babies, and he just hates to see them go. Tony starts to tear up, and he gets emotional and says, I don't know if I'm about to cry. And I think it's kind of, and Dr. Murphy's kind of like saying, look, the ducks, you and those ducks represent your family. And there's a connection between the ducks and your family. And Tony says, so you think that with me having these ducks, I'm going to lose my family? And Tony says, and Dr. Murphy asks Tony straight up, what are you afraid that's going to happen? Tony says, I don't know. Back at the Sopranos residence, Tony is barbecuing some sausages, and Artie is still feeling sad about the fact that his restaurant burned down, and he feels terrible that his life dream has gone up in smokes. And Tony says, look at the bright side. You get the insurance money, don't you? And but what would stop people? But and Artie's kind of like crying, going, with people coming to the restaurant. Artie says, but why would people stop coming to the restaurant? And Artie's like, the restaurant's starting to catch on. Tony looks at the grill, and you know what I've been thinking of lately. That's that's talking helps, which Polly and all of them agree with him. And Artie breaks down and starts to cry, in which Tony says, "Why don't you just let him cook?" And then he makes him feel better, and so we see Artie's kind of cooking, and um, see, Tony notices Christopher sitting by sitting in a long chair, looking out at the party, and uh, Christopher, he walks, and then Tony walks over to Christopher, folds his arm. He tells Christopher, I told him that we torch the restaurant. That's the best solution. While Christopher looks quietly outside as the party is going on, consuming his thoughts. Tony asks Christopher, what's going on? In which Christopher says, Tony, how about just a little, Tony gets, and Christopher gets a little bit um, kind of defensive and says, how about just a simple way to go, Chris, or a on the Tribur Towers contract would be nice. The fact that he just murdered the Polak people, or the kosher people that he did. Says, Tony, how about just a some way to go, Chris, on the Tribal Towers contract would be nice. Tony says, I have no defense. That's how I was parented, and never on the Trevor Towers contractor would be nice. Tony says, I have no defense. That's how I was parented. Never supported Uh, then Christopher and Tony that he has, Christopher tells Tony that he has a cousin, Gregory, whose girlfriend is a producer, or as he likes to call her, a development girl out in Hollywood. And when he mentions Hollywood, Tony gets pissed and grabs Christopher by the shirt and says, um, call her and threatens that, threatens to kill him. And Tony, with his eyes staring directly at Christopher, says, "You know how many mobsters are selling screenplays and screwing everything up?" Then Christopher she says I could maybe even play myself. Tony comes down, he's kind of holding him up, and he slowly comes down, um, and says to forget all about that Hollywood screenplay nonsense. Those are distractions. We have work to do and do new avenues, and how everything is going to be all right. Tony tells Christopher it's going to be a beautiful day, and they all walk back to hang out at the barbecue. We then cut to Olivia and Uncle Junior in the car. They're heading over to the rescheduled birthday party, and Olivia pretty much thanks her brother-in-law for picking her up. Then Olivia starts ranting, and I love the fact Olivia's like ranting over the fact that her son won't pick her up anywhere, and that when she's at the nursing home, he'll lock her in there. And he talks about how he'll lock her in there and she'll die faster. Junior tells Olivia that his brother John was a man amongst men. I like the fact that Junior kind of really brings Olivia, or brings John, his brother, into more higher standards than his nephew. Um, and that Tony has basic, and then John, or Junior, tells her that Tony has kind of not given Junior the freedom to run his own business the way he wants, and tells her that Tony he made it difficult for his uncle to run his business. He mentions the six, and then I like the fact that he kind of mentions kind of what the '60s were like and gays in the military. He tells Olivia that they're no longer that their business is no longer recession proof. He mentions that he's been told to told to have a hand in the family, and that something has to be done about Tony. They drive to the party. Party for Anthony Jr. Go eat, and they walk in the kitchen. End of pilot. So it's kind of a so that was the pilot episode of of um of The Sopranos, and I feel like does feel like a mini movie, and it really paints the cast in a really good light, or it kind of paints the characters. We kind of understand who Tony is. We understand, that this pilot gives it enough time for it to breathe, and I think that's what makes it such a good pilot. I think that the acting's really good. I liked how Tony. We kind of It's just kind of an opening just to kind of get me into this show, and I think it really works out really well. I think that the characters are interesting, even the small ones. Like I feel like I can kind of see where Tony and Uncle Junior can't really see eye to eye, and it's gonna be interesting as I'm watching the series how it's going to affect it. But for most part, this is a really good show, and I like our good episode. I mean, really strong pilot, really strong pilot, and I think I think what makes this pilot really great is that, as I said, pilot is uh, each character really, this pilot gives each character a time to breathe. So it really works really good. This show, kind of like Breaking Bad, I feel like, really uh, pulls you in and you kind of want more. And I think this pilot's a great one. I'm going to give it 92 out of 100 on my 1 to 10 scale, A plus. I'm really liking it. I think this is a good show. As always, I'm Steve, and see you at the movies. Bye.